November 1986. Phoenix, Arizona. An escrow closes on a parcel of undeveloped desert land known as Hidden Valley, roughly 1,000 acres of scrub northwest of the city. The sale price is approximately triple the parcel's prior recorded valuation, and the buyer's down payment, when later traced by federal regulators, originates in a chain of accounts that leads back to the seller. The seller is Lincoln Savings and Loan. On the closing date, Lincoln records a profit on the transaction in the range of $11 million. According to the subsequent regulatory and judicial record, not a single dollar of independent, at-risk buyer cash changed hands. The question this episode answers is how a federally insured thrift booked a real gain from a transaction it had, in economic substance, funded on both sides. Begin with the instrument. The mechanism at the center of Lincoln Savings and Loan is not exotic. It is a real estate sale. Specifically, it is the recognition of gain on the sale of land. Under the accounting standards in force in the mid-1980s, when an institution sold an asset for more than its carrying value, the difference was recognized as profit. That profit flowed into earnings. Earnings flowed into net worth. For a savings and loan, net worth was the regulatory foundation on which everything else rested, because federal rules required a thrift to maintain a minimum level of capital relative to its assets and liabilities. So, the accounting question that governs this entire case is deceptively simple. When may a seller recognize the gain on a real estate sale? The answer, then as now, is not when the deed changes hands. The governing standard was the accounting profession's framework for profit recognition on real estate sales, which in this period was embodied in the Financial Accounting Standards Board's pronouncements on the subject. The core principle is that a sale is only a sale for accounting purposes when the economic substance of a sale has occurred. And the economic substance of a sale requires, among other conditions, two things that matter enormously here. First, the buyer must have made an adequate initial investment. The buyer must have real money at risk. The purpose of this requirement is straightforward. If the buyer has put down a meaningful, non-refundable payment of the buyer's own funds, that payment demonstrates the buyer's commitment and provides evidence that the sale price is genuine rather than fictional. A buyer who has staked nothing has not truly bought anything. The buyer can walk away. The transaction is, in substance, an option or a consignment or a financing arrangement dressed as a sale. Second, the seller must not retain the risks of ownership, and critically, the seller must not be the source of the buyer's funds. If the seller lends the buyer the money to make the purchase or funds the down payment through an intermediary, then no independent capital has entered the transaction. The seller has simply moved an asset from one pocket to another and written itself a receivable. There is no counterparty bearing genuine economic risk. Under the standard, such a transaction does not qualify for full profit recognition. It may qualify for no profit recognition at all, or for the deposit method, or the installment method, treatments that defer the gain until real cash arrives. This is the baseline. A legitimate land sale that produces recognizable profit requires an independent buyer with the buyer's own money at risk, in an amount adequate to demonstrate that the price is real. Now hold that baseline in mind, because the architecture Lincoln constructed was designed, according to the enforcement record, to produce the appearance of that structure while eliminating its substance. Lincoln Savings and Loan was acquired in 1984 by American Continental Corporation, a company controlled by Charles Keating. Lincoln was, at the time of acquisition, a traditional California thrift. Its assets were largely home mortgages. Within a period of a few years, its balance sheet was transformed. Under American Continental's control, Lincoln shifted heavily into direct real estate investment, land, development projects, corporate securities, and equity positions. The deposits that funded these investments were federally insured, which meant that the downside risk of these investments was ultimately borne by the Federal Insurance Fund and, behind it, the taxpayer. The transformation depended on a regulatory environment that had, in the early 1980s, substantially loosened the constraints on how a state-chartered, federally insured thrift could deploy its deposits. California, in particular, permitted its thrifts to make direct equity investments to a degree federal thrifts could not. Lincoln operated under that state charter. This is the structural precondition. Without the ability to hold land and development ventures directly, the daisy chain would have had nothing to circulate. Now, the architecture. The record, as developed through federal regulatory examination and subsequent litigation, describes a recurring pattern. It is best understood as a sequence of steps. Step 1. Lincoln, or an affiliated entity, holds a parcel of raw land carried on the books at a particular value. The land itself is often speculative desert acreage with no infrastructure, no water rights adequate for development, and no near-term prospect of the development that would justify a high valuation. Step 2. A buyer is identified. But the buyer is not an arm's-length purchaser who has appraised the land, negotiated a price, and arrived with independent financing. The record establishes that in the transactions at issue, the buyers were frequently entities that had a relationship with Lincoln or American Continental. In some cases, they were parties to whom Lincoln had extended or would extend credit. In some cases, they were participants in other Lincoln deals. Step 3. The purchase price is set at a figure well above the carrying value. This is the number that generates the paper gain. The Hidden Valley closing in November 1986 illustrates the magnitude. A parcel is sold at roughly 3 times a prior valuation, producing a recorded gain in the range of $11 million. Step 4. And this is the load-bearing step. The buyer's down payment does not consist of the buyer's own independent funds. The record shows that the funds used by buyers to make their down payments were, in the transactions at issue, traceable back to Lincoln or its affiliates. The money moved out of a Lincoln-related account through intermediary accounts and returned as the buyer's investment. Consider what this means structurally. If the down payment originates with the seller, then the seller has funded both the asset and the buyer's stake in acquiring it. The buyer has contributed no independent capital. The adequate initial investment condition, the single requirement most essential to distinguishing a genuine sale from a circular bookkeeping entry, is not satisfied. It is defeated by design. Step 5. Lincoln finances the balance of the purchase price. Having provided the down payment through the chain, Lincoln then lends the buyer the remainder. So the entire consideration for the sale, the down payment, and the finance balance alike originates with the seller. The buyer signs a note. Lincoln holds that note as an asset, and Lincoln books the gain. Now walk the full circle. Lincoln starts with a parcel of land. Lincoln ends with a note receivable from a buyer who has no independent money in the deal, secured by the same land, carried at a value inflated to produce $11 million of earnings. The land has not left the economic sphere of Lincoln and its affiliates in any way that transfers real risk. What has been created is not a sale. It is an accounting event. The Senate committee that later examined these matters and the federal regulators who brought the enforcement actions described transactions of this general character as linked financings. The linkage is the essence. In a legitimate market, a seller sells to a buyer, and the two are strangers to each other's balance sheets. In the linked structure, the seller arranges the buyer's down payment, and arranges the buyer's financing. Sometimes the linkage ran in both directions. Lincoln would purchase something from a party, and that same party would purchase land from Lincoln, each transaction manufacturing gain, each dependent on the other, neither reflecting an independent market. This is why the term daisy chain is apt. A daisy chain is a closed loop in which each link depends on the next and the whole circles back to its origin. Money leaves Lincoln, passes through a series of hands and returns to Lincoln as recorded profit. At no point in the loop does an independent, at-risk party set a genuine price through the exposure of its own capital. The scale mattered. According to the regulatory findings, transactions structured to recognize gains on real estate were a significant contributor to Lincoln's reported earnings in these years. Those reported earnings supported Lincoln's regulatory capital. That capital, in turn, permitted Lincoln to continue holding and growing a large book of high-risk assets funded by insured deposits. The gains were not merely cosmetic. They were the mechanism by which an institution that was, in economic substance, losing money on speculative ventures could report itself as profitable and solvent, and thereby continue operating. There is one further architectural feature the record establishes: the tax treatment. American Continental filed consolidated tax returns. The structure of these transactions and the movement of funds among affiliated entities produced tax benefits at the parent level. The record developed by regulators indicated that Lincoln paid substantial sums to American Continental under a tax-sharing arrangement, effectively upstreaming the insured thrift's resources to its parent. The land transactions and the tax structure were not separate systems. They were parts of a single architecture that converted a federally insured deposit base into reported profit, upstreamed value to the holding company, and deferred the recognition of the underlying losses. Draw the org chart. At the top, American Continental Corporation, the holding company controlled by Charles Keating. Below it, Lincoln Savings and Loan, the federally insured thrift, holding the deposits. Around Lincoln, a constellation of affiliated entities, subsidiaries, and related buyers. Between them, a flow of funds that leaves the insured institution, circulates through the constellation, and returns as gain. That is the architecture. Now the question that governs every case on this channel: where were the gatekeepers? A federally insured savings and loan does not operate in the dark. It has external auditors who certify its financial statements. It has federal regulators who examine it. It has, above them, the agencies charged with insuring its deposits and enforcing capital rules. Each of these was a verification point. Each was, in principle, positioned to test whether Lincoln's reported gains reflected real sales. The structural question is why the linked financing character of these transactions was not caught, or was caught and not acted upon in time. Begin with the accounting verification. The condition that these transactions violated adequate independent buyer investment is not obscure. It is precisely the kind of thing an audit of real estate gains is supposed to test. To verify a recognized gain on a land sale, an auditor examines whether the buyer made an adequate down payment and whether that down payment consisted of the buyer's own funds. The defect in Lincoln's transactions was traceable. The funds could be followed. The relationships between Lincoln and its buyers could be identified. What the record establishes is that the tracing was difficult by design. The chain of accounts through which the down payment funds moved was not a straight line from Lincoln to the buyer. It passed through intermediaries. The relationships among the parties were not always disclosed on the face of the documents. To detect the linkage, a gatekeeper had to do more than read the sale agreement. The gatekeeper had to follow the money out of Lincoln through the intermediate accounts and back to the buyer's down payment, and to establish that the buyer's stake was not the buyer's own. This is the work of tracing, and tracing is expensive, adversarial, and dependent on access. There is a second detection failure, and it is regulatory rather than accounting. In the mid-1980s, the federal examiners responsible for Lincoln, working out of the San Francisco office of the regulatory structure then in place, conducted an examination and reached conclusions adverse to Lincoln. The record of the subsequent Senate inquiry establishes that these examiners identified serious problems, including transactions of the linked character described here and violations of the direct investment regulations. The examiners recommended action. What happened next is the detection failure that defines this case. The examination and the recommended action did not proceed to prompt enforcement. Instead, the matter became the subject of intervention. 5 United States senators, who had received substantial campaign contributions from Charles Keating and entities associated with him, met with the federal regulators regarding Lincoln. The record of these meetings, developed by the Senate Ethics Committee, establishes that the senators inquired into the handling of the Lincoln examination and pressed the regulators on the pace and character of their action. The senators became known collectively by a phrase that entered the public record, the Keating Five. The structural point is not the moral one. The structural point is this: the verification chain for a federally insured institution ran through a regulatory apparatus that was itself subject to political pressure, and the institution's controlling party had cultivated relationships at the political level precisely where that pressure could be applied. When the examination reached an adverse conclusion, the response was not immediate enforcement. The matter was contested, delayed, and in part relocated. Regulatory jurisdiction over Lincoln's examination was, for a period, shifted away from the office that had reached the adverse finding. The delay had consequences that compounded, because every quarter that Lincoln continued to operate, it continued to book manufactured gains, continued to grow its high-risk asset base, and continued to expand the eventual loss to the insurance fund. Consider what would have had to be true for detection to have produced timely action. The examiners did detect. The failure was not primarily one of detection at the examination level. The failure was that detection did not translate into enforcement on the timeline the findings warranted. For that translation to occur, the enforcement process would have had to be insulated from the intervention that the controlling party was able to mobilize. It was not insulated. This is a structural feature, not an accident. An enforcement apparatus that can be slowed by political intervention is an apparatus in which a well-connected institution can convert time into continued operation, and continued operation into a larger loss. There is a third gatekeeper, the market for Lincoln's and American Continental's securities, and the outside professionals who opined on the enterprise. The land transactions produced appraisals. Appraisals are supposed to be independent judgments of value. In transactions where the price is set to produce a predetermined gain, the appraisal is under pressure to validate the price rather than to test it. The record on the Lincoln matter includes concern about appraisals that supported valuations the underlying land did not warrant. An appraisal that certifies an inflated price is not an independent verification. It is a component of the machine. Now, assemble the detection picture. The accounting verification could catch the defect only by tracing funds through an intentionally obscured chain. The regulatory verification did catch the defect, but was slowed by political intervention before it could act decisively. The appraisal verification was compromised at the point where independence was most needed. 3 verification layers, each defeated in a different way. The first by concealment, the second by pressure, the third by capture. No single layer was designed to fail. The architecture ensured that each layer faced the specific obstacle most likely to neutralize it. This is the recurring structural lesson of linked financing frauds, stated not as a moral but as a mechanism. The defect is detectable in principle at each gate. The fraud survives because it raises the cost of detection at every gate simultaneously, and because it exploits the seams between gates, the places where one verifier assumes another has done the work. Now the unraveling. The daisy chain has a structural vulnerability, and the vulnerability is intrinsic to its design. Because no independent cash enters the loop depends entirely on continued circulation. The recognized gains are not cash. They are accounting entries backed by notes receivable from buyers who have no independent capital and by land carried at inflated values. The institution needs continuous inflows of real money, insured deposits, to fund its operations, its interest obligations, and its ongoing investments. The gains do not generate that cash. They only generate reported earnings and regulatory capital. So long as deposits keep coming in and the regulators do not force recognition of the true asset values, the structure persists. The moment either condition fails, the structure has no cash to fall back on, because the substance underneath the reported profits was never there. The sequence of exposure proceeded along both the regulatory line and the securities line. On the regulatory line, the adverse examination findings, having been delayed, ultimately could not be permanently suppressed. Federal regulators continued to press on Lincoln's direct investments, its accounting for gains, and its compliance with capital rules. The reorganization of the federal thrift regulatory structure in 1989, prompted by the broader savings and loan crisis, brought new authority and renewed scrutiny. In April 1989, American Continental Corporation filed for bankruptcy protection. The following day, federal regulators seized Lincoln Savings and Loan and placed it into conservatorship. The seizure crystallized the loss. Once the regulators controlled the institution and marked its assets to their real values, the reported net worth that the manufactured gains had supported evaporated. The land was worth a fraction of its carrying value. The notes receivable were backed by buyers with nothing at stake. The gains reversed. The cost fell on the federal insurance fund and behind it, the taxpayer. The estimated cost of resolving Lincoln ran into the billions of dollars, and Lincoln became one of the most expensive single failures of the entire savings and loan crisis. That cost is the difference, made visible between the profits Lincoln reported and the economic reality the reported profits concealed. On the securities line, the exposure was more direct, and for many individuals, more immediate. American Continental had sold subordinated debentures, corporate bonds, through the branches of Lincoln Savings and Loan. Thousands of purchasers, many of them elderly depositors, bought these bonds at the thrifts branches. When American Continental filed for bankruptcy, those bonds became largely worthless. The purchasers were unsecured creditors of a bankrupt holding company, not insured depositors of the thrift. The insurance that protected deposits did not protect the bonds. This is a structural distinction that the record establishes was, for many purchasers, not understood at the point of sale. The bond losses were the sharp edge of the collapse, the point where the failure of the enterprise translated most directly into individual loss. The enforcement and judicial record followed. The Securities and Exchange Commission pursued enforcement in connection with the enterprise. Charles Keating was prosecuted. He was convicted in state court in California and in federal court on charges arising from the enterprise, and served a period of incarceration. Portions of those convictions were later overturned on appeal on grounds relating to jury instructions and other procedural matters, and the record of the litigation is complex. What the enforcement and judicial record collectively established across the regulatory findings, the bankruptcy examination, and the litigation is the structure this episode has described. An insured thrift whose reported profits derived substantially from real estate transactions that lacked the independent buyer investment necessary to constitute genuine sales. The Senate Ethics Committee, separately, examined the conduct of the 5 senators who had intervened with the regulators. Its findings varied among the 5, ranging from criticism of poor judgment to more serious rebuke. The committee's inquiry placed on the public record the sequence by which regulatory action on an adverse examination had been contested at the political level. That record is itself part of the structural finding of this case, the demonstration that the enforcement gate could be slowed by mobilized political influence. Trace the collapse mechanism one more time, because it is the mirror image of the construction. To build the reported profits, Lincoln circulated its own money through a loop and recorded the return as gain. To collapse the reported profits, the regulators seized the institution and stopped the circulation. Once circulation stopped, there was no independent cash to reveal, because there had never been any. The carrying values fell to their real levels. The gains reversed into losses. The net worth vanished. And the difference, the gap between the paper and the substance, became a bill paid by the insurance fund and by the bondholders. A daisy chain does not fail gradually. It fails at the moment it is forced to produce the independent cash it never contained. What does the Lincoln case establish about the mechanism? It establishes that the accounting condition most essential to real estate profit recognition, adequate independent buyer investment, is also the condition most vulnerable to circumvention through affiliated party structures. The requirement exists precisely because a sale without independent buyer capital is not economically a sale. Lincoln demonstrates that the requirement can be defeated not by ignoring it, but by simulating compliance, producing a down payment producing a buyer, producing a signed note, while ensuring that none of it represents independent capital at risk. The defect is invisible on the face of the documents. It is visible only in the flow of funds. It establishes, second, that in a federally insured institution, manufactured accounting gains are not a private matter between a company and its shareholders. They are a mechanism for keeping an insolvent institution operating on insured deposits, and every quarter of continued operation transfers additional risk to the insurance fund. The accounting fiction and the public liability are directly linked. This is why the treatment of real estate gains in insured thrifts was not merely a technical accounting question. It was a solvency question with a public bill attached. The regulatory response followed from these findings. The savings and loan crisis, of which Lincoln was among the most prominent and costly instances, produced the Financial Institutions Reform, Recovery and Enforcement Act of 1989. That legislation restructured the federal thrift regulatory apparatus, abolished the existing regulatory and insurance bodies, and created new ones with different lines of authority. It tightened the rules on direct investment by insured thrifts, constraining precisely the kind of equity and land investment activity that had made the Lincoln architecture possible. It strengthened capital requirements and the standards for what counted as capital. And the accounting profession's attention to the recognition of gains on affiliated and linked real estate transactions was sharpened by the visible cost of the failures. The finding, stated as a forensic review, states its findings. Lincoln Savings and Loan reported profits from land transactions that, according to the regulatory and judicial record, lacked the independent buyer investment necessary to constitute completed sales. The profits supported the regulatory capital that permitted the institution to continue operating on insured deposits. When the institution was seized and its assets marked to their real values, the profits reversed, and the difference between the reported and the real became a loss borne by the Federal Insurance Fund and by the purchasers of American Continental's bonds. The mechanism was a closed loop through which the institution's own funds circulated and returned as recorded gain. The gain was never independent. That is the finding, and it is sufficient.